Hey everybody, the next project on my 1966 Lincoln Continental is going to be removing everything from under the hood. Now, my original intent was to do this all in one video, but I've decided to break this up into a few different projects. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove all of the AC components. That's going to be removing the AC condenser, the dryer. It's also going to remove the lines that went to the AC compressor that is already out of the car. I removed that before removing the motor. I'm going to remove the muffler, the lines that go to the evaporator core. I will remove the heater core and the evaporator core, but in order to remove the evaporator core, we also have to remove the blower motor and the blower motor housing. So let's go ahead and get started on that part of the project now. Okay, we're going to remove the AC condenser, the AC receiver dryer, and these two lines. Now we're only going to remove it using this line because that's the only thing that's holding this into the car. So we're going to use both a 5/8 open-end wrench and an 11/16. Now you might be wondering, why am I not removing these lines now to separate the condenser? And that's because the condenser is no longer mounted in, so I don't have too much leverage here, and I know how difficult it can be to get off AC condenser lines, and I don't want to end up stripping them or mangling the AC condenser. So we're just going to remove all of this together, and we'll separate these later. Continuing with more AC parts, we're going to follow these two lines that go to both the expansion valve and the evaporator case, and we're going to remove those. Now, in order to expose the fitting and the line here, I'm going to have to cut away at this insulation, and then I'll be able to also remove this line from the expansion valve, and this is going to be held on, it looks like, using a 13/16 on this side, and we'll be able to hold the expansion valve body here using a 3/4 inch wrench. With the insulation now removed, I can get to the fittings here, and it's going to take larger than a 1 inch on both of these. So I'm going to use 2 adjustable wrenches to loosen this line and take it off. All right, the only thing holding these two lines on is this block right here. There is a loop here holding this wiring harness that's being held on with a 7/16, so we'll remove that. Then there's a 1/2 inch bolt right here. We will remove that. Then there's just a couple of wire ties that I used to put this out of the way when I was pulling the engine, so I'll cut those out and remove these two lines. All right, we're now going to remove the evaporator. You'll notice the expansion valve is still connected, and that's because the line from the evaporator to the expansion valve is stuck on. This line was starting to bend, and the expansion valve was starting to strip as I was trying to pull it apart. So we're just going to take this all out together. And to get started on that, we'll remove this brace, which is being held on with 2 9/16 bolts. We're now under the passenger side fender well area where we're going to remove the splash shield, which is being held on with a series of 6 1/2 inch bolts, and that will allow us to gain access to the evaporator. All right, we're now back under the hood and on top of the evaporator, and what we're going to do now is remove this module, which I believe is called the icing control module. So there's going to be 2 wires that we'll need to unplug here, and then there's 2 8mm bolts, and there is this line here that goes into the evaporator, so we're just going to move this out of the way. All right, one quick thing to note is that the shop manual discusses taking out the sensing bulb, and you'll see that there's a hard line that goes to the back of the expansion valve. And because I can't get the expansion valve off of this line, there's no need for me to take off the sensing bulb. However, if you're able to get off your expansion valve, go ahead and remove the sensing bulb and move that out of the way, and you would remove it by taking off this one bolt using a 5/16 socket. All right, we're now back under the passenger side fender well, and we're now going to remove this boot that connects the blower to the evaporator, and we're going to remove this clip as well as 4 5/16 bolts.
All right, the next step is to remove this wire assembly clamp, which is being held on with 2 screws, and we're going to use a 3/8 socket to remove both. One is accessible here from inside the engine bay. The other one is technically inside the engine bay, but it's much easier to access from inside of the fender well. So let's go ahead and take those off now. Next, we're going to remove this insulation from the Evap core, and there's just 2 bolts holding it on, and we're going to use a 5/16 socket to get those off. With the insulation now off the evaporator, it exposes a series of about 13 different screws that we're going to take off. And we can either use a flathead screwdriver or we can use a 5/16 socket. And I'm going to use a 1/4-inch drive with an extension and a 5/16 socket to be able to gain access to a majority of these screws. All right, all 13 screws are now removed. I'm now going to unplug that wiring from the Evap core case. All right, I'd like to pause here to discuss these 2 vacuum lines and this electrical connection that I did not discuss earlier in the video, as I didn't realize that I actually removed them. So when I removed that shield earlier, little did I know that the windshield wiper pump was attached to the back of that shield. It was being held on with 3 5/16 bolts. And when I pulled that shield off, it also just pulled these vacuum lines and that electrical connection off. So I want to point out here that there's 2 vacuum lines, one going to the reservoir, one going, which is most likely going to a solenoid. I see that the vacuum line goes through the firewall. So the larger one here goes to the reservoir. The smaller one here goes to the vacuum line that goes through the firewall. And then there's the electrical connection right here. So again, wanted to call that out so everyone is aware. All right, before we can remove that Evap core case, we're gonna have to remove the blower motor, which is being held on with 4 5/16 bolts. And then we're gonna remove the blower motor housing, which appears to be held on with 5. It looks like 3 on the bottom, 2 on the top. And then we will disconnect these electrical connections as well. All right, we're now ready to pull out the Evap core. It is held on with 4 bolts. It looks like 5/16 bolts, mounting it to the dash. However, this too is also going to be much more easily accessible from underneath the fender well. According to the shop manual, there are 4 clips that need to be removed that are attaching the Evap core to the case. I do see what appears to be 3 clips here. However, I see this 5/16 headed screw, and there's also a series of about 5 screws that are underneath this insulation. So what I'm going to do is move this insulation back. I am going to remove these clips. I will remove this bolt, and I'll see what it takes to remove those other 5 screws. And I think that's going to allow this Evap core to come out. Next, we're going to remove the temperature blend air door variable actuator, or otherwise known as the vacuum actuator. And in order to do that, we're going to have to remove this clip off of the arm, remove this vacuum line, and there are 2 bolts, and it looks like it's going to be a 5/16 to take those out. Next, we're going to remove the heater core cover plate, which appears to be held on by about 5 or 6 5/16 screws, as well as 1 nut. And with that, we can now lift out the heater core.
Great, all the AC system parts are now out of the car. So next steps, I'm taking the AC condenser down to a radiator shop to get verified if it's still good. Otherwise, I'll have to go with an NOS OEM or reproduction. I did find an NOS OEM dryer on eBay. That's going to go back into the car. I will be reusing the original AC lines that go to the AC compressor and the muffler and then over to the Evap core. I will be getting a reproduction expansion valve. And I also have that same radiator shop, Radiator Land in Santa Clara, not only checking out the condenser, but they're also going to check out the Evap core as well as the heater core to see if they can be reused. And then I also sourced an NOS OEM blower motor from Lincoln Land. So that is also going to be going back into the car. So stay tuned for more content on my 1966 Lincoln Continental. Thanks, guys.